Hello everyone and welcome to another Elden Ring tier list. Today we're going to be going over incantations. In particular, we're going to be going over the utility incantations. As a quick preface before we begin the actual content to this video, I am splitting up the incantations into 3 parts. The first reason is because my PC doesn't like to, it can't handle long editing sessions without significant slowdown. So the hour-long video that the sorcery tier list was a bit of a pain to edit. Secondly, there are a lot of incantations, and not only is it more digestible to break them up into parts, but I feel like it's also more fair to each individual incantation. So, I will be breaking the incantations up into the parts of utility, damage, and perhaps a little controversially, Dragon Communion. I'm making Dragon Communion incantations their own category because, first of all, I don't think they're very good, or at least not nearly as good as the normal damage incantations. So I want to give them a fair shot in comparison to each other. And also because they function very differently compared to all of the other incantations. So those are the categories I've decided on. Now, let's jump into the tier list. Assassin's Approach, I think, is going to get a C tier. It's not useless, it's actually surprisingly useful in PvE, especially if you're doing any sort of stealthing around large enemy groups. But in PvP, it's almost entirely useless. Maybe if you're doing invasions in some of the cramped areas like the mining tunnels, you can pull off some sneaky attacks on hosts around a corner with your advantage that you get from the silenced footsteps. However, there is a talisman that does the exact same thing, so I don't know if I would consider it worth the attunement slot in general. Barrier of Gold is going to get an S tier for the utility spells. This is hands down one of the best utility incantations in the game, especially in PvP, because of how powerful magic is and how many weapons do magic damage. Everybody likes to complain about the Moonveil, although I suppose Rivers of Blood is more in vogue to complain about nowadays. But this reduces all damage from the Moonveil weapon arts by perhaps 25% in my testing. That's incredibly powerful. In PvE, it can still be useful against certain enemies. If you manage to pick up Barrier of Gold before fighting Renala, this easily trivializes all of her damage, aside from her summons, I suppose, but even then, that's not a significant portion compared to all of the magic attacks she throws at you. And any other enemies that do primarily magic damage will be absolutely neutered by this incantation, so for that, it gets an S. Next, we have Beastial Constitution, which I am going to put in D tier. Beastial Constitution removes all blood loss and frost buildup, and I can't say I find this very useful for all of these one-tick damage statuses. The gameplay revolves around not letting it build up to begin with, meaning you should be dodging or you should be staying out of the way of anything that causes these. You should be managing your status without having to remove it. And even if you do feel the need to run a spell or an incantation to alleviate this buildup, there are easily craftable items for it for the very few times you're going to need it. In PvP, if you're running against someone that's using a bleed build or a frost build, simply not going to have the time to cast this incantation and cure yourself of the buildup. So for that, I'm going to give it a D. Do not use this incantation. Beastial Vitality is actually quite good, and I think I'm going to give it an A. Although it doesn't have the level of HP regeneration of some of the more powerful utility incantations, the fact remains that this only requires 12 faith. Almost any build can use this, and it gives you a free 600 health over the course of 2 minutes. That's really non-trivial in PvE or PvP, and I would recommend picking it up if you're running a build that can afford the investment. Next we have Black Flame Blade, which I'm going to give a C. As far as damaging buffs go, Black Flame Blade should be one of the better ones. The damage over time effect is significant on all of the Black Flame spells, and it's worth using them for that alone. It adds an extra 100 or 200 damage onto any hit. However, Black Flame Blade, despite having a very fast cast time, it feels like you only get 2 hits in on any boss before it runs out. Maybe if you're running a Dex Faith build that has a lot of virtual decks and thus increasing the cast time even further, this can have some use because you can keep reapplying it in downtime in boss fights and in PvP. Maybe you can find some use. But as far as weapon buffs go, I would just rather use any of the other ones. Black Flame's Protection is up next, and I think I'm going to give it a B. It's really not a bad incantation. It gives a non-trivial amount of physical damage negation, and if you're against a boss or an enemy in PvP that does a lot of physical damage, this can be a sizable bump to your survivability. The downside is it reduces your healing. As far as I'm aware, this only impacts flask healing, so in duels this would be a straight benefit, but I'm not entirely sure on that front. Of course, if you're in PvE and you are healing with your flasks consistently, perhaps you are not the most proficient player in dodging enemy attacks. The trade-off of extra survivability for what is essentially less survivability maybe is not the trade-off you want to make. Next we have Blessing of the Erd Tree and Blessing's Boon. I'm going to rate both of these at the same time because they do the exact same thing. Both of the blessings have the same effect as Beastial Vitality, except they work in an AoE. So in a co-op environment, you can grant the HP regeneration to your party members as well. In addition, they cost a lot more mana, they have a much higher faith requirement, but in return, they regenerate a lot more health. I think I'm going to give both of these a B above Black Flame Protection. I'm giving them both a B for different reasons, despite the fact that one is perhaps a strict upgrade over the other. Blessing of the Erd Tree costs twice as much mana, 60 mana. That is absolutely significant, and not every build is going to be able to shoulder that mana cost, especially if you're running a faith build and you have that 38 faith requirement. You're probably going to be using other incantations and you don't want to spend all of your mana on just health regeneration. Blessing's Boon only requires 24, which is more reasonable to fit in a build that does side faith, or maybe it does faith buffs but is mostly a physical build. Regardless, I would not rate either of them better than Vitality, especially if you're playing solo. Perhaps if you're doing co-op, I would put this higher. I would put this in A, but if you're not, I would leave both of these in B. Next we have Bloodflame Blade. Bloodflame Blade easily gets an S. This is one of the best weapon buffs in the entire game. The bleed buildup over time in conjunction with any weapon that does bleed on its own can lead to incredible amounts of bleed procs over the course of a fight in either PvP or PvE. The incredible thing about bleed in this game, as I may have mentioned before, is bleed is always a stagger. No matter how much poise an enemy has, bleed will always stagger. And that makes it incredibly valuable in both PvP and PvE. On top of the bleed buildup, this adds extra AR to your weapon as well, and that just is icing on top of the cake. Next we have Cure Poison, which I'm going to give a C. Poison isn't an instant proc when the bar builds up. It does damage over time, and that means you can avoid a lot of damage by curing poison. Although, just like with Beast Vitality, there are easily craftable items that are quicker and cost no mana. Darkness is the next incantation we're going to talk about, and I think I'm going to give that one a C as well. It's much like Assassin's Approach in that it's more useful in PvE than PvP. However, like I mentioned in my sorceries video with the Frost Cloud spell, there can be some interesting shenanigans with obscuring your movement or obscuring spell casts or incantation casts that puts the opponent on edge, especially in invasions that can take her in cramped spaces. So it's absolutely not useless and can actually have some interesting creativity to it. In PvE, it seems to be like Assassin's Approach, but worse. As far as I can tell, this doesn't work on every enemy. It does work on most of them, at least the basic enemies, but not all of them. And that means sometimes if you're trying to pull off a sneak attack or if you're trying to get away, you wasted your casting time and your 34 mana to cast this incantation all for nothing. Divine Fortification is up next, and I think I'm going to give that one a B. It is the weaker of the two Holy Damage Negation miracles, but that does not mean it's useless. It does have a lower mana cost, and most notably a very low faith requirement, requiring only 10 faith to cast. Given the amount of holy damage in this game, especially in PvE, with enemies like the Elden Beast, or anything in Mikla's Haligtree, this can provide some significant damage negation for you. In PvP, it's a little less useful. Personally, have not run into a large amount of holy builds. Mostly, I find a lot of fire and magic, and a little bit of lightning. So not incredibly useful there. But overall, not a bad incantation. Next we have Dragon Bolt Blessing, which I think I'm going to give a C. I'm really not a big fan of this incantation in particular. This incantation's effect neuters your lightning damage negation in return for increasing status resistances and making weapons bounce off your body. Light weapons in particular, so no ultra great swords here. Genuinely, I don't know how useful I would find this in almost any situation. The extra status resistance is nice, but it's really not game-changing. And making weapons bounce off your body, while it can be useful in both PvE and PvP, in PvE you should probably just be dodging or blocking instead of letting yourself get hit. And in PvP, as far as I can tell, weapon arts are immune to this bouncing effect, meaning if someone's using the aforementioned Moonveil and Rivers of Blood, they can spam their weapon art into you, and your benefit from this buff is essentially non-existent. There are use cases for this, but I'm going to go ahead and say that they're relatively minimal. Electrify Armament is up next, and I think I'm going to give this one an A. All weapon buffs in this game are actually decently strong. And Faith in particular has the benefit of being able to match the weapon buff's element to the damage type that the enemy is weak to. So in PvE, that's a particular strength. In terms of the AR that this is going to boost your weapon with, it's going to, of course, depend on your incantation scaling. However, I've found with anywhere between 250 to 300 incantation scaling, you can expect somewhere in the realm of 200 AR added to your weapon, which is definitely decent. Erdtree Heal, I'm going to give a high B, I think. This incantation is a large AoE heal for the cost of not only incredible amounts of mana, but also a very high faith requirement. Once again, as with the blessing incantations, the value of this goes up tremendously in a co-op environment, and I'm sure you can have some fun with this in those boss fights with a couple of your friends. The heal amount is definitely sizable. This will heal a tremendous portion of your HP bar, so it feels like the mana cost is justified. In PvP, this will almost definitely never help you. The cast time is far too long, and I wouldn't be surprised if attempting to cast this in PvP would grant you a nice sword in your rear. Flame Cleanse Me is up next, and this one I'm actually going to put a low B compared to its brother, the Poison Cure. The reason why is because Flame Cleanse Me not only cures poison, but also Scarlet Rot. In PvE, this can be incredibly useful. There are a lot of areas with unavoidable rot damage, especially the Lake of Rot, which can be very frustrating to go through. And there are a certain amount of invaders or even dual builds that will run a rot setup, and if you can find the time to get this off, the cast time isn't that long, you might be able to. I am going to mention, just like all of the other cure spells, there are items that do this for you, so the use of this incantation in the face of those items is certainly lessened. Flame Fortification, I'm going to give a B as well, next to the holy damage negation and the physical damage negation. Once again, this is one of the weaker forms of damage type negation. It has a very low faith requirement, it doesn't cost too much mana, and it can be helpful if you're running a low faith build, something with a little bit of faith on the side. I would consider the incantations in this vein, the lower end ones, all around equally useful. If you use them in the correct scenario against the right bosses and the right enemies, they can help you a lot. But generally speaking, I would rather just use the greater version. Up next is Flame Grant Me Strength, which I think is actually a kind of interesting buff. This incantation gives you both physical damage and flame damage. So if you're running a build that does both, if you have a weapon that does physical and fire damage, for example, the Blasphemous Blade that you can get from the Remembrance of Rykard, this can be an absolutely incredible damage boost for you. The downside is it really doesn't last very long. I believe this lasts 30 seconds, which may last the entirety of a duel, but definitely won't last the entirety of a boss fight or even an invasion with how much running around goes on in those. You can get almost another 10 seconds of this buff if you use the Old God's Talisman, which increases buff duration by 30%. So that's something to keep in mind when you're using this particular incantation. It gets an A because in the right situation, this can be one of the most powerful buffs in the game, but it doesn't get an S just because it doesn't last quite long enough. Flame Protectomy is coming up next, and as we previously mentioned, with all of the damage type negation spells, I am going to give the more powerful one more of a benefit. In the right situations, getting a 60% damage defense buff can be absolutely a game changer. In boss fights that do a lot of fire damage, like against Rykard, for example, this can be the difference between victory and defeat. Similarly, in a PvP scenario, there are a lot of people that run builds that do a lot of fire damage using some of the fire incantations or weapons that do fire damage, and in those situations, this spell can be a game changer as well. In a similar vein, next we have Golden Lightning Fortification, which I think I'm going to give a high A. The reason this one's not going in the S tier like the others is there just aren't enough situations where lightning damage is a meaningful threat. I think in PvE, the only place that you're really going to be threatened by lightning damage is the Crumbling Farum Azula. And in PvP, although there are some builds that center around lightning damage, the majority just have a little bit of lightning damage as perhaps an incantation or a buff, meaning it's not the main source of their damage, and you're not going to get as much value from this incantation. Still very strong in the correct situation, but not as generally useful as the two I put in S already. Golden Vow, however, easily gets an S. This incantation is incredible. For the low requirement of 25 faith, this boosts physical damage as well as overall damage negation. Granted, this is nerfed a little bit in PvP. However, if you have the ability to use this incantation and you're running a perhaps pure dex, quality, or strength build, this is absolutely worth picking up. In PvE, this can result in boosts of up to 200 physical AR, which is incredible. You can expect around half of that in PvP, so around 100, but that's still an incredible amount of damage. And that's not even counting the defense buff. So for its overall usefulness, this one is getting an S. Up next, I'm going to place Great Heal and Heal at the same time. Great Heal is going to get a high B, and Heal is going to get a low B. Great Heal fills a very similar niche to Erd Tree Heal. The heal is significant, and the mana cost is fairly high. However, the faith requirement on Great Heal is much lower. Once again, this can be pretty useful in co-op and PvE. In contrast, the normal heal, despite still having a pretty sizable mana cost, I feel does not heal enough. I think the only reason I would ever use Heal over Great Heal is obtainable earlier in the game. Other than that, Great Heal is definitely the one to use of the two. In PvP, just like before, you are probably not going to get this spell off, and even if you do, you're going to take a sword in the back trying to do it. Howl of Shabriri is up next, and I think I'm going to put this one in low A. This is kind of an interesting buff spell, because it also builds up madness in the person casting it and everybody around them. This means that not only does this give you a 20% damage buff, but it also can be used to create pressure on enemies. Not necessarily in PvE, because there are few enemies in PvE that can be afflicted with Frenzy, but in PvP, assuming you get a hard knockdown on an enemy, it's not inconceivable that you could run up, cast this spell to force them to roll away, especially if they have prior madness buildup, if you're running a build that has a lot of madness infliction, with either Vike's War Spear or any of the damaging frenzy spells, and get a free 20-second, 20% damage buff off. It is a little more niche in its application compared to some of the other buffs like Golden Vow or Flame Grant Me Strength, but I think that it's powerful enough in PvP to grant it a higher spot, although on the lower end of A. Immutable Shield, I think, is going to get a high A, actually. This is kind of an interesting incantation. Not only does it increase the block percentage and the stability of the shield, but it also increases ailment resistance. And this includes things like bleed, frost, and poison. This makes any kind of turtle build, both in PvE and PvP, considerably powerful, especially because PvP at the moment has a lot of status builds with both bleed and frost. You can hold your shield up with this buff on it, take very little damage, if any, and take 0 ailment buildup. If the only threat to you is someone inflicting a bleed proc, this one incantation can stop it. Everybody running a turtle build with an S-stock or a spear should absolutely look into picking up this incantation. It is very powerful. Law of Causality is going to get a high C. This incantation is supposed to work as a counter hit measure. After you take a certain number of hits, it releases a big AoE that does a decent amount of damage. However, in PvP, I don't think there's any reason to not dodge attacks instead, and simply counterattack with your own spell. In PvP, the AoE is slow enough that someone can get the last hit in, proc the spell, and then roll away, nullifying all of the damage. There are use cases for this. For example, if you're blocking yet still taking damage in a large crowd of enemies, that can stack up the individual hits needed to proc this spell, and then the AoE damage will clear them out for you. However, for the most part, I wouldn't consider this incantation particularly useful. Law of Regression, on the other hand, I think gets a high A. Debatably, you could even consider this a low S, I think. The reason this incantation is so strong is because not only does it heal any status afflicting you, but it also removes any buff on the enemy. Those Lyondell perfumers that buff themselves with a one-hit damage negation, it removes it. Anybody in PvP that buffs themselves with a flask or a miracle, this removes it. And although the cast time is slow, the range on it is quite large. It is definitely significant. And that increased range means that you can pull this off in PvP pretty safely, and you can definitely pull it off safely in PvE. The real downside to this miracle is that it doesn't have any faith requirement. Instead, it has a pretty chunky intelligence requirement. This means that it just doesn't fit in a lot of builds. So despite its power, I think you'll find it's difficult to find a place to use it. Lightning Fortification is going to go along with the lesser buff spells, and I'm going to go ahead and put Magic Fortification in there as well. Once again, these can be useful, they have a low faith requirement, and if you put them in the right scenario, they can help you survive a lot. However, the greater resistance variants do not require that much more faith, they add a lot more damage negation, and in my opinion are a lot more useful. Up next, Lord's Aid I think is going to get a high C. This is another one of those status negation incantations. It gets rid of poison, blood, and sleep buildup in an AoE around you, so including any allies if you're in co-op. The issue, like I've said before, for blood loss and sleep particularly, they are one-tick procs, meaning that you should really be managing the buildup of the bar before this happens. And for curing poison, unless you really value the AoE of this, I would always go for Flame Cleanse Me instead. Lord's Divine Protection is going to get an S as well. It's another one of those buff spells that increases damage type negation. In this case, it's holy damage negation. This one incantation can completely trivialize the entire Elden Beast fight. If you're having trouble with that fight, because I know a lot of people do, especially with the bad camera, this incantation will help you out tremendously. In PvP as well, there are a lot of weapons that do primarily or entirely holy damage, and this can trivialize those encounters as well. For that reason, like the other two high negation buffs, this is going to get an S. Lord's Heal is going to get a high B next to the other two AoE healing spells. At the risk of sounding redundant, it does a very large heal, it costs a lot of mana, This one in particular, though, does not have a particularly high faith requirement in return for the size of the heal. So if you're choosing to run an AoE heal spell, maybe for co-op, then this is the one that I would pick. Noble Presence is up next, and I think I'm going to give this one a low B. The range on this is very short, the cast time on it is pretty long, and it doesn't do that much damage either, even when you're buffing it with the Godskin Noble chest armor. The one benefit to this incantation, especially in PvP, is it does force a hard knockdown, which can put you in a very advantageous scenario where you can follow up with a roll catch or some other kind of pressure, or even it gives you enough time to cast a very quick buff. Unfortunately, the difficulty of landing this is so high that I would honestly just tell you not to use it. But the benefit is such that I can't call it useless or even mostly useless like in C tier. Order Healing is going to get a D, much like the other instant proc statuses. I think that the most effective way to combat them is simply to avoid them or manage them while you're fighting the enemy. In PvP, not a whole lot inflicts death. I know there's that somewhat cheesy interaction where people can set themselves on fire and use the Eclipse Sickle to buff it with death. I don't know if that's been patched yet, but if it hasn't, it's going to be pretty soon. That seems like a pretty abusive mechanic. In PvE, not only do very few things inflict death, but even if they do, I think they're pretty easy to avoid. So this gets a D, don't use this. Order's Blade is going to get an A next to Electrify Armament. This does the exact same thing as Electrify Armament, except it adds holy damage. Everything I said about Electrify Armament can apply to Order's Blade, with the exception of Order's Blade having a little bit of a weird stat requirement, with both 13 Faith and 13 Intelligence. That can make it a little uncomfortable to fit into builds. However, just like all of the other weapon buffs, it is plenty powerful and it's worth picking up if you're planning on buffing your weapon. Poison Armament, on the other hand, I'm going to give a low B, and to be honest, even giving it a low B is pretty generous. This does not add any damage to your weapon, all it does is add poison buildup. In PvE, there aren't a whole lot of things that are susceptible to poison. If they are susceptible to poison, it requires a lot of hits to get that buildup, and for that reason, it's just not incredibly useful in PvE. In PvP, you might be able to do a poison dedicated build, but in my opinion, I think it would be significantly less effective than either Bleed or Frost, as both of those do 1 tick damage that isn't avoidable and can't be cleansed with a simple item. Protection of the Erd Tree is, I think, going to get a high S. This is easily one of the best buff skills in the game. This increases all elemental damage negation by a significant amount. And because of that, honestly, if I had to run a single protection buff, I would just pick this one. It doesn't have the potency of any of the dedicated greater negation buffs, but its increased utility means you can be a little lazy, just keep this one buff and it's good in almost every scenario. Similarly with PvP, if you're buffing before an encounter, this will protect you regardless of their build unless they're running a purely physical build. This is a very strong incantation and it's absolutely worth picking up if you can foot the 35 faith requirement. Rejection is going to go next to Noble Presence. It has a very similar function. The trade-off here is Rejection is much easier to land, but it doesn't have any of the damage or the hard knockdown. It can be a pretty interesting get-off-me tool. If someone's pressuring you pretty hard, or maybe they're blocking a lot, you can get off a Rejection, and this will do some pretty good guard damage, or cause a little bit of a stagger. I don't know if you can true combo a Rejection into a quick weapon hit like a dagger. If you can, I think this would easily get an A. But based off of the effect alone, not useless, still worth using in the scenarios that it's good in, but not nearly as strong as anything in S or A. Shadow Bait is going to get a high B. You might think this is a little hypocritical for me to put Assassin's Approach or Darkness in C or low C and put Shadow Bait in high B, but Shadow Bait functions essentially like Alluring Skulls in Dark Souls or Soul Remains in Demon Souls. Almost every basic enemy in the game will run right up on where you cast this, start mindlessly attacking it, and that leaves them open to AoE attacks or simply running by them if you don't want to deal with it. In PvE, this is probably one of the strongest exploration incantations in the game, especially for the low faith requirement of 13. In PvP, it's literally useless. This does nothing but waste your mana and your time, but it's so strong in PvE that I still think it gets a high B. And finally, we have Urgent Heal, which I'm going to put in low B. It is a very quick, very small heal. This can be, I guess, useful for topping you up if you take a little bit of chip damage during an encounter. And in PvP, if someone is keeping too much of a distance, you can pop this and get a little extra health on top of what you have, assuming that you took damage. However, the heal amount is so small, it's almost negligible unless you have a pretty high incantation scaling. And if you do have enough faith to give you that high incantation scaling, I would say it's more worth using any of the negation incantations to buff your resistances rather than giving you a pittance of healing. And I almost forgot to mention Vike's Dragon Bolt because I put it in the wrong folder for this. Vike's Dragon Bolt is one of my favorite incantations. I think it is a really cool spell that can add a lot of build variety. Not only does it give you a substantial damage buff to your weapon, assuming it can be buffed along the lines of Electrify Armament, although not quite as potent. It also increases your equip load, which means you can do some really interesting things along the lines of running the Old God's Talisman to increase this buff duration even longer, and equipping some very heavy armor that would normally leave you fat rolling, but you can sneak out a mid-roll when you apply this incantation. Alternatively, you can use it to move from a mid-roll to a light roll, and that can be equally useful. The light roll goes very far in Elden Ring. Of course, like the other lightning body buff, this does come with a downside, and in this case it is lightning damage negation. Because it is not just a strict buff, I don't think I can put it in high A or S. However, I will be putting it in low A for the build variety and the damage. And that is going to wrap up part 1 of my 3-piece series on Elden Ring incantations, this one covering all of the utility incantations. Please let me know if there is anything I missed, anything you enjoyed, anything you didn't like. Any feedback is greatly appreciated. I'm still trying to improve in my video making process. Regardless, I hope you all learned something or just enjoyed the video, and thank you all so much for watching.